There is a particular kind of silence that lives inside a hospital room at dusk. It is not the peaceful kind. It is the kind that presses against your chest like a slow, steady weight. The kind that makes the beeping of machines sound lonelier than it should. The kind that makes a woman lying in a hospital bed realize, with perfect and terrible clarity, exactly who chose to walk out the door and who chose to stay. Margaret had been staring at that door for the better part of an hour. The light outside had turned golden, the way it does in late summer, evenings when the sky seems almost reluctant to let the day go. She could see the city skyline through the narrow window beside her bed, tall buildings catching the last warmth of the sun, glowing like something precious. She had built 2 of those buildings. She had financed 3 more. But right now, in her pale blue hospital gown with her hands folded quietly in her lap, she looked like nothing more than a tired woman waiting for someone who was never coming back. His name was Dominic, and he had left 40 minutes ago. They had been married for 9 years. 9 years of shared mornings and quiet dinners, of building what Margaret had genuinely believed was a life worth having. She had loved Dominic with the steady, unshowy kind of love that does not announce itself loudly, but simply remains. She had supported his career when it struggled. She had been patient through his moods, his silences, his long stretches of emotional distance that she always told herself were temporary. She had never told him about the empire. That was the thing people would later find most remarkable. Margaret Chen Williams, quietly and methodically, over the course of 15 years before she ever met Dominic, had built a real estate and investment company that now held assets valued at just over $100 million. She had a board of directors. She had offices in 4 cities. She had a team of 32 people who answered to her. And yet at home, she made dinner on Tuesday nights and asked Dominic how his day went and listened. Genuinely listened, because she believed that a marriage was made of small ordinary moments just as much as large extraordinary ones. She had kept her professional life private, not out of deception, but out of a deeply personal conviction that she did not want to be loved for her wealth. She had watched too many people become their money. She had seen too many relationships dissolve into transactions. She wanted something real. She believed she had found it. She had been wrong. The diagnosis had come 3 weeks earlier. A cardiac arrhythmia, serious but manageable with the right treatment and proper rest. The doctors had been calm and reassuring. The procedure was routine. The recovery would take time, but Margaret would be perfectly fine. She had told Dominic everything. She had sat across from him at their kitchen table, hands wrapped around a mug of chamomile tea, and explained the situation clearly and without drama. She had watched his face carefully, the way a person does when they need to see something true. What she saw had stayed with her. It was not fear. It was not even sadness. It was something closer to inconvenience. He had said the right things, of course. He always said the right things. He had nodded and squeezed her hand and told her everything would be fine. But in the days that followed, she noticed how often his phone pulled his attention away from her. She noticed the evenings he came home later than expected. She noticed the new cologne. She had chosen not to say anything, not yet. She was tired, and she was preparing for a medical procedure, and some part of her, the part that still hoped, was not quite ready to look directly at what she already knew. The morning of her procedure, Dominic had been present. He had driven her to the hospital. He had sat beside her while the nurses prepared her, and he had held her hand briefly. And she had felt the ghost of something warm in that gesture, enough to hold on to. But by the afternoon, when she was resting in recovery, groggy and quiet and still wearing the paper-thin gown, she had looked over at the chair beside her bed and found it empty. She had asked the nurse where her husband had gone. The nurse, a kind woman named Vera, who had seen enough of human nature to keep her expressions carefully neutral, had simply said he had stepped out to take a call. That was 2 hours ago. Margaret had not cried. She was not the kind of woman who cried easily. Instead, she had done what she always did when something needed to be understood. She had become very still, and she had thought. Downstairs, in the golden late afternoon light outside the hospital entrance, Dominic stood with his phone in one hand and a smile on his face that Margaret had not seen directed at her in a very long time. The woman beside him wore a red dress the color of a warning. Her name was Cassandra, and she was laughing at something he had said, her hand resting lightly on his arm, her whole posture radiating the easy, confidence of someone who believed she had already won. They had been seeing each other for 7 months. Dominic had convinced himself, with the flexible logic of a person who wants to believe his own story, that his marriage had already been over long before Cassandra arrived. He had told himself that Margaret was cold, distant, too focused on things he did not understand. He had told himself he deserved more warmth, more attention, more of whatever it was he thought Cassandra was offering. He had not once considered what Margaret deserved. Standing there in the fading sunlight, leaning toward Cassandra and away from the building behind him where his wife lay recovering from a cardiac procedure, Dominic felt something he mistook for freedom. He did not know, as he smiled at his phone, that 3 floors above him, Margaret was making a phone call of her own. She called her attorney first, then her chief financial officer, then her most trusted board member, a woman named Gloria who had known Margaret for 20 years and asked no unnecessary questions. By the time the sun had fully set, a process had been quietly set into motion. Margaret was not an impulsive woman. She did not make decisions from the raw edges of hurt. She made decisions from a place of clarity, and right now, lying in a hospital bed with steady hands and a calm voice, she had never been more clear about anything in her life. The marriage was over, not because Dominic had walked out, not because of the red dress or the smile or the 7 months of deception. It was over because Margaret had looked honestly at what had been missing for years, and she understood, at last, that she had been trying to preserve the idea of a marriage rather than the reality of one, and that was no longer something she was willing to do. 3 weeks later, Margaret walked out of the hospital under her own power, wearing her own clothes, greeted in the lobby by Gloria and 2 members of her team who had brought coffee and quiet smiles and asked nothing more of her than she was ready to give. Dominic had been served with divorce papers the previous morning. His attorney had called, and the conversation had been brief. The prenuptial agreement, which Dominic had signed without reading carefully 9 years ago, had been drafted with considerable precision. He would leave the marriage with exactly what he had brought into it. He had called Margaret directly afterward. She had let it go to voicemail. The message he left was long and tangled, a mix of anger and confusion and something that might have been, at its edges, the beginning of regret. He used the word unfair several times. He said he had not known. He said she had kept things from him, as though that were the wound at the center of all of this, as though the real injury had been the withholding of financial information rather than the desertion of a recovering wife. Margaret listened to the message once, sitting in the back of a car moving through the city she had helped shape, watching the buildings pass in the gray morning light. When it ended, she set the phone down gently on the seat beside her and looked out the window. She was not angry. She had moved through the anger quietly, in the still hours of those hospital nights, and what remained on the other side of it was something she had not expected. It was not bitterness. It was not triumph. It was something simpler and more durable than either of those things. It was relief. The relief of a woman who no longer has to make herself smaller than she is. The relief of someone who has stopped waiting for a person to show up who is never truly present. The relief, quiet and deep and entirely her own, of a life that now belongs completely to the person living it. Spring came. Early that year to the city, Margaret stood at the floor-to-ceiling windows of her corner office on the 22nd floor, coffee in hand. The skyline laid out before her in the pale morning light. 2 of those buildings were hers. She was currently in negotiations to acquire a third. She thought briefly and without pain of Dominic. Then she turned back to her desk where her day was waiting. And she began.